It's a great opportunity to be talking to Professor Bob Sinclair. Could you please introduce yourself and what do you do for business?
Well, I'm Bob Sinclair. I do consulting work, but I also do academic research. And I spent a great deal of my life studying how we think or how we feel affects how we think. So the relationship between mood states or the effects of mood states on cognitive processes.
Yeah, that's interesting. So the first question is, what is halo?
Well, halo is an error that occurs in performance appraisal. Well, it can occur in generally in performance appraisal judgments when evaluators, like your boss, for example, is evaluating you on a bunch of different dimensions. So one dimension could be who. How good is he at selecting people to interview? Another one would be, how good are his interviews? Another one would be feedback from the audience, these sorts of things. Now, and you're evaluated on some scale from extremely poor to extremely good or something. And the problem that you encounter with halo is when people performing the performance appraisals fail to discriminate across judgment categories. And so they rate someone high across the board, neutral across the board, or low across the board. Now, it's unlikely the case in any organization that you have a person, well, I wouldn't say it's highly unlikely, but I'd say it's unusual to have somebody who's just absolutely good at everything, okay? People have their pros and cons. And so when the people doing the evaluations don't discriminate and they don't actually go, yes, he's good here, he's marginally good here, he's sort of just okay here, he does a good job here, and at writing memos, for example, he does a really terrible job, okay? We all have our pros and cons. Now, this is a problem in industrial organizational psychology and in organizational behavior, because if people don't pay attention and don't learn to discriminate when they're making their judgments, performance appraisals become problematic. They become less meaningful, less valid. Now, in my research, looking at the first study I did on this stuff, this is one of these things where you can study theoretical issues with applied independent and dependent variables. So you can study something theoretical in an applied setting, and anyhow, I started thinking about moods, because people always talked about the benefits of good moods. People are more likely to help someone else if they feel good. But it turns out that's only if the helping doesn't interfere with them feeling good, okay? People who are happy people tend to categorize broadly. So they're more likely to see a cane, like a walking cane, as an article of clothing. Well, I don't know if that's good or bad, right? Is it that they're just being all inclusive and they're pulling everything into the same category? And they're failing to discriminate? I don't know. People in good moods have been shown to do things like more bizarre associates and more free associates and free association tasks. And I just started thinking about all this. I said, we wouldn't have evolved to the point that we're at if bad moods And I particularly focused on sad, although I did do some on I like sad, depressed kind of moods. I'm not talking about depression. Okay, I'm talking about the regular kind of sad. You know, some days you get up, you just don't, you feel kind of down, and other days you get up and you feel good. Okay, so I'm just talking about normal sadness and happiness, but I always do this experimentally. So I make some people happy and some people sad, and then I get them to do various judgments. And there are tons of different methods that I've used to induce happiness and sadness. I used to induce neutral too, but turns out it always fell in between happy and sad in terms of judgments, in terms of everything. So I just stopped using it. But often they don't even know that I'm trying to induce a mood. I might tell them I'm developing a life events inventory for university students. And I give them a box, and the box has 200 slips of paper in it. And I say, what we found is it's best when we're getting people to do this, we get them to focus on one kind of life event. So there are 200 different life events in this box, and I want you to pull one out, and that's what you're going to write about for 15 minutes. Well, of course, I've got two boxes, and one has 200 slips of paper that say happy, and another one has 200 that say sad. And then at the end of my session, I thank them very much, and I leave. Oh, I actually measure their moods. I say to them, well, one of the things that I need to do today is that I need to measure how you feel, because how you felt today might have affected what you wrote about, okay? And all I'm measuring really is their mood to make sure statistically that I made the happy people happy and the sad people sad, right? It's just a special dependent variable called the manipulation check. And then I have somebody else comes in, and they're doing something completely different. They're looking at this performance appraisal stuff, right? And I had them read about a guy. Actually, in this study, they read about the guy first, and then I did the mood induction, and then later on, they evaluated the guy. But the bottom line is, in these studies, all of them, they involve two different experimenters, and it looks like there are two different experiments going on at the same time, because we don't want them to figure out what we're trying to study. And this is really important in the kind of research that I do, because the hypotheses that people might develop on their own really aren't what I expect to find, okay? So if I said to you, what do you think you'd find here? It's really unlikely that you'd tell me what I wanted to find, because it's not the hypothesis that somebody just pick up off the top of their head. So anyway, what I found was that happy people didn't discriminate across categories when they were doing performance appraisals of these employees who happen to be university professors. And people in sad moods discriminated across these categories. And I also found that the happy people were less accurate than the sad people, because there was a way that I could measure accuracy there. And some people can argue about it, but instead of arguing about it, I'll tell you, instead, I did another one where I had a really objective measure of accuracy. My students in a class, I said, look, we got a test coming up next week, and a bunch of you have been dropping by my office, and you don't seem to understand the concept of correlations, but we have to do our first lab today. So then afterwards, I'm going to give you a little demonstration thing, and we're going to go over it. And so I said, what we're trying to do today is I just want to try and validate this new mood induction procedure that I developed, okay? So I gave them the instructions, told them what to do. So this one, it was just right out in the open, okay? You know, sometimes we use music, sometimes we use autobiographical recall. Sometimes they don't know we're trying to manipulate their mood. Sometimes they do know we're trying to manipulate their mood. And this one they did. And then, so then I get them to complete this mood measure. So and this is what they're going to write up for their first lab assignment. And indeed it was, they did. And then I said, okay, I handed out a piece of paper that had 9 scatter plots on it. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, a scatter plot's just, you know, if I plotted temperature against air temperature against ice cream sales, and I could put little dots all the way up. And what you'd find is as air temperature increases, ice cream sales increase, okay? And I could put a little ellipse around them. And the closer the dots are, the ellipse is to a line going straight up, the stronger the correlation is. And of course, we can have a negative correlation, which goes this way. So like the relationship between, let me think of a negative. I always have a hard time with a negative correlation just popping up off the top of my head. Where as one goes up, the other goes down. So taxation, as income increases, eventually your tax bracket drops, okay? It's curvilinear though, but, and so this is why the 1% seem to pay no taxes. So anyway, it's all of us middle class geeks who are paying taxes. So anyhow, what I found was that this, and I asked them to estimate the correlations associated with each of these scatter plots. And what I found was that the people in sad moods were more accurate. And it's pretty hard to argue against that. I mean, all I did was I took what their estimate was, and I subtracted it from what the true was, and then I squared that because I have to take care of the fact that there can be negatives, right? And so it was mean squared deviation from the true correlations. And what I found was, of course, the sad people were more accurate. And I found this in a whole bunch of different studies. I found it, sad people pay attention to arguments and happy people don't. So if you're trying to, happy people tend to pay attention to things that are called peripheral cues. By a friend of mine, Rich Petty, would have called them peripheral. These are things like how attractive the person is who's selling the product. Or, you know, the classic one is, I'm not a doctor, but I play one on TV. Well, why the hell should I listen to this guy? He's an actor, okay? If you're going to present arguments to people and persuade them, they need to be strong if you want to persuade them, right? But also, people have to pay attention to them. If they're not paying attention to them, doesn't matter what the arguments are because they're not paying attention to them. So it turns out that sad people will pay attention to arguments and they're persuaded by strong arguments and they counter-argue weak arguments, okay? And they reject them. They go, no, this is really stupid, you know? And happy people are unaffected by argument strength. That means they're not paying attention to the arguments at all, right? They're not really reading them. I don't know what they're doing, drifting off into Never Never Land, but they're not paying attention. And we did the same thing. Eventually we did some work with one of my graduate students and I, where we got people to build circuit boards, and sad people made fewer errors than happy people in building circuit boards. They went through the same number of steps, but the happy people made more mistakes. We also found in that study that if happy people thought that doing well on the task would make them happy, they actually did just as well as the sad people. And we did another study where we did that was that if happy people think that paying attention to things is going to make them continue to be happy, then they pay attention. But if they, I think that their default is paying attention to something that's going to take away from my happiness. And one of my grad students also, he and I could collaborate on some stuff where we even stopped looking at moods per se, and we just started looking at affective cues, like things out in the environment and the psychological environment. You kind of think of it this way. You could be walking down the street and you see somebody who looks kind of grumpy and angry. Well, you might kind of walk around them. It doesn't really affect how you feel. And if somebody looks kind of happy and whatever, you don't pay much attention. It doesn't affect how you feel. So what we did was we started off doing this with color of paper. And he picked out this color of red paper and color of blue paper that he, I don't know, sifted through, and he got people to answer questions from the graduate record exams. And what he found was the people in the blue paper did better, but there was no difference in readability, and there was no effect on mood. But the blue seemed to signal some sort of negative cue, and the red seemed to signal something positive. And the green or the blue paper, they did better than the reds. So I said to him, I don't believe this, do it again. And I got him to do it again. And I got him to do it again because I still didn't believe it. I said, this is garbage. So then I had an exam in one of my introductory psychology classes. And so what I did was I printed the exam on this blue paper or this red paper, and I randomly assigned people to get, they thought it was two different forms of the exam. So I was preventing cheating, right? So they got the blue form or the red form. Well, it turns out that the people who did it on the blue form got significantly higher grades than the people who did it on the red form. And then I had to go through this whole adjustment, Angoff's adjustment, to take care of the fact that, you know, basically the form of the exam screwed people. And so I had to fix this, okay? And then he took it one step further, which was interesting. Was he brought people into a lab and he said, I'm studying how people give speeches, you know, because we give speeches the time we try to convince people of things. And he said, so one of you is going to be the speech giver and one of you is going to be the person listening to the speech. And I'm going to get you to draw a piece of paper to see who's the giver and who's the audience. And of course, we have it rigged so that the person giving the speech is always the participant. The audience member is somebody working with us. And the audience member either nods and kind of smiles or looks really serious. And what happens is, doesn't affect the person's mood who's actually reading the arguments, that we got them to read these strong and weak arguments to the other person. Well, what happens is when they're looking serious, they pay attention to the arguments and they're persuaded by strong arguments and they reject weak arguments. But when the person's just nodding and smiling, they pay no attention to the arguments. Doesn't matter whether the arguments were strong or weak. So then he took this one step further and he presented these on a computer screen. And what he did was, he presented happy or sad faces on a computer screen, and then for 13 milliseconds. That's really fast, okay? And then he slapped an argument over top of it on the computer screen, and he got people to read these arguments. And afterwards, he measured how much they were persuaded. And the people who got the happy faces were not persuaded as much as the people who got the sad faces. So that kind of runs through a gamut of what I was doing with this stuff. I can give you some explanations for why I think it's going on, if that's...
Yeah, go ahead,
like
please.
that.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Well, there's one of the explanations involves like a feedback loop. And that is that your moods provide you with information about your life, okay? And so when you feel happy, it tells you everything's going well and you don't have to pay attention. But when you're feeling down, you feel sad, that's feedback saying, gee, something's going wrong. I need to pay attention to what's going on around me. Okay. And if you pay more attention, of course, you're going to make better judgments in most situations. And the other thing is, if you make good judgments, that should help you get out of your bad mood. And if you're paying attention, focusing on something, that helps distract yourself from your bad mood. Another explanation had to do with what was called cognitive capacity. And the idea was that happy moods restricted cognitive capacity. So they restricted working memory. It's like, imagine you had a sheet of paper and the paper's full and you can't write anything else down there. The happy people would be forced to use these little shortcuts and heuristics and not be able to pay attention. Turns out that there's no evidence to support that particular argument. There was one study that showed it, and I've never found anything to support it. And I mean, I did a study with a few other colleagues, and this gets back to this kind of mood as information stuff. What we did was we approached people on campus, and what we did was we used the weather as a proxy for a mood induction. Because on nice days, people actually do feel happier than on not so nice days. And what we did was we read them 3 arguments advocating comprehensive final exams for graduating university students. And a comprehensive exam would be an exam that covered everything in their 4 years as an undergraduate, and they'd have to attain a certain grade to graduate. Now, this is something that you'd think would be people would want to pay attention to. Well, anyway, well, we read them either 3 strong arguments or 3 weak arguments. But it turns out on nice days, they're not affected by argument strength. They don't pay any attention. On not so nice days, they do, and they're persuaded by the strong arguments, but not by the weak arguments. However, we had one more condition in there, and that was, we said to them, because we measured all of their moods, right? We said to them before the mood measure, and before we read them this stuff, we said, you know, the weather can affect how you feel. So I need to get you to evaluate the weather too today. Well, now what we've done is we've given people an external attribution. Well, I feel good, but it's not because my life is going well. It's because it's nice out. Or I feel bad, but it's not because my life is going bad. It's because it's nice out. When we do that, everybody pays attention to the arguments. Okay? Now, cognitive capacity, why all of a sudden was having an external attribution for your mood state? Why would that free up cognitive capacity? Makes no sense. Okay? So this working memory argument is out the window at this point. So we've got this affect as information, and then we've got mood maintenance and affect repair. That is, I pay attention because it makes me feel better, and that's affect repair. I don't pay attention because it's going to take away from my good mood, and that's mood maintenance. And all of these things play into how we process information and finally make judgments.
So you recommend that we don't live happily to
No.
be able to meet?
Nope. Not at all. I mean, I think that people need to tune themselves to situations and realize that most of the time, your moods are being generated from something external, okay? It's not telling you about your life. Yes, it's good to feel good, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your life is going fantastic. It just means you feel good. And similarly, when you feel down a bit, there's other things that are making you feel that way. And so if we can try and separate these things, and especially like you don't want employees going to work and hating going to work, because at least in North America, job satisfaction is not related to productivity much at all, but it is related to turnover, people, and absenteeism. So people who don't like their jobs they take off work as much as they can because they're going to look for other jobs because they're dissatisfied with their job. Now you might say, well, if we have a situation where it's menial labor and there's lots of unemployed people, so what? Okay. However, if you're talking about a middle-level executive at General Motors in Detroit who you dump $200,000 into training them, and that person just says, bye-bye, okay, you've lost an investment, right? So you want to make sure that you keep these people happy. But what about the ones that aren't performing very well? Maybe you just don't keep them, you just let them make the decision on their own to leave. Then you don't have to pay all the severance and everything, That sounds evil, doesn't it? That's the corporate consulting side coming out on me. Mostly, I'm more interested into the theoretical issues involved in this, but there are applications. But I think that what we need to do is, you want to separate your moods from your judgments, and you want to recognize that your moods can affect your judgments, and that they can affect your judgments in ways in which you could end up making judgments that would negatively or adversely affect your life. So that's pretty much what I have to say.
Yeah. So let's go to a bit more in detail. What is the Mark Sinclair model?
Well, Mel, Mark, and I started working on this stuff. I think that model we came out in 1992, 1994, I forget which.
Yeah, 1992.
It's a long time ago. So anyway, the model was basically says, look, we got mood states here, and then we've got all these possibilities that can lead to processing strategy. So we had an arrow that went up to cognitive capacity and then down to processing strategy. We had an arrow that went to mood maintenance and affect repair and then to processing strategy and judgments. And then we had another one went down to mood as information or affect as information. And it had a direct and an indirect arrow going to mood state and then affect and judgment. But essentially that's the model that I just talked about. And essentially I'm saying there's no evidence for this cognitive capacity stuff. So really what we've got is evidence for this mood maintenance and affect repair, and we've got evidence for affect as information, that you're getting feedback from your moods that telling you something about your life. Sometimes it's giving you good feedback. To be honest with you, sometimes it is, but sometimes it isn't. And so what you got to be able to discriminate between is when it is and when it isn't. Okay, so like you got back your grades on, your exam, and you got 100%, okay? And you're happy. Well, your mood's giving you feedback that's worthwhile, okay? But if you're happy because the sun's shining, the feedback there is saying, oh yeah, my life's going well, but guess what? The fact that the sun's shining doesn't mean that your life's going well.
Yeah, great. So what is the accuracy of attribution?
Pardon me?
The accuracy of attribution.
Can you give me more context?
Let's say, for example, as you said, like you are happy, and then you say you are happy because your life is good, while it is not.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay. What we were doing was, I kind of talked about that already. We gave people an external attribution for their mood. That was the study with the weather in it, okay? We said, well, you might feel some, because of the, look out what it's like out today. So I got, so what we did is we cued them to the weather. So we got them to attribute their moods to the weather. And then all of a sudden, we wipe these mood differences out, right? The happy and sad people both process the same. When we don't give them an external attribution, so the weather is an external attribution, when we don't give them an external attribution, they see their mood as reflecting something going on. Yes, my life is good, or no, my life isn't going great. But it really didn't have anything to do with that. It had to do with the weather. They just didn't know that, because we didn't cue them to the weather as the source of their mood. So we got some people to attribute their mood to the weather and others not to.
Yeah. What else would you like to add about this topic?
Well, I think that I want to get back to something that you said earlier is we need to inform people about the effects of how they feel on how they think, so that we can try to enlighten them in manners that they understand when their moods really are telling them something about their lives or when they aren't. And we also have to be, and then when you go back to this mood maintenance and affect repair stuff, well, yeah, if people think that, if people in bad moods sad moods figure that they can pay attention to things, and if they do really well on it, it's going to make them feel better, which is affect repair, and also distracting themselves, well, that's actually kind of a good thing. You're getting the process systematically. And the happy people, well, they don't pay attention. Well, if we can switch this up a bit so that we can just get everybody to pay attention, and there are ways of doing that, I believe. We need to get people to, if they're at work doing something, to separate how they feel from what they're doing at the particular job. Now, that doesn't mean when you get feedback from your boss and he says, this is a great job, that shouldn't make you feel good and you shouldn't internalize that. Of course you should internalize that, okay? But that doesn't mean the next day you come into work, then you don't pay attention to what you're doing. So, and then, but out in your regular world, feeling happy is good. It's much better to feel happy than to feel sad. And you got to be careful too when you're making judgments out there in the real world, because when you're happy, you're more likely to, say, not pay attention to in much detail when you're deciding between buying, product A and product B in terms of price, for example. When product B is the same as product A, but product B costs much less, okay? So just paying attention to those things is fine. I'm not saying you want to go out and be sad, because I certainly don't want to do that, and I don't want to see you doing that. But I think there are lessons to be learned, is to understand that how we feel does affect how we think, and that sometimes when we feel good, we make mistakes. We make bad judgments, and take more care when we're making judgments when we're feeling good. And if you're going to go buy a new car, get in a bad mood first.
Okay. Now let me ask you an ethical question here. Like, is your research conducive to discrimination in the workplace between the high paying posts and the low paying posts?
No, I have no idea, because I mean, all of our participants in all of our research were introductory psychology students. But I'll throw in another ethical issue, though, is at the end of our studies, we always put everybody through a happy mood induction before they leave the lab.
Okay.
Maybe they'll go out and make some bad judgments, but we make them happy before they go.
Yeah. I'm really, really happy to have been talking to you, Professor Bob, today. I really appreciate your happiness and your useful input. I cannot appreciate that enough.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure, Nour.